in the Cloud Security Masterclass series. Today, we have a conversation with Greg McCord, the Global Head of Information Security at CalAmp. Chat is open now for the duration. So please ask any questions or make any comments that you'd like to make, pose to Greg or Josh during this conversation. Make sure that you choose panelists and everybody else when you post to the chat and not use the Q&A function, so we can make this as open and interactive for everybody involved. I just wanted to let everybody know about an upcoming Cloud Security Masterclass we have on Thursday, June 23rd. That one's going to be focusing on locking down the security of AWS IAM. It will be a technical deep dive. And last week, we did a session that was a deep dive into the security of S3. You can find that on demand. And it turned out to be so action-packed that we will need to be doing a part 2 session on S3 security. So look for that coming up in July. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Josh and Greg. Welcome.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Sivia. And Greg, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, this is one of my more favorite topics, so this is good.
Yeah, I think we're both passionate about this stuff, right? And one of the reasons I'm super excited to have you here for this conversation is a lot of the questions that we get, we'll do like a technical deep dive, and then people come back and ask about the practice. And I can talk about my perception of that, but you've had a very different experience that I think can bring a lot to the table that I just simply wouldn't know. So maybe to start, if you could give folks a little of your background and what your job is at CalAmp.
Yeah, so I'm essentially the head of security here. So and that's globally, right? So we've got offices in Italy, UK, Mexico. We've got other, smaller offices spread throughout the world. So my responsibility is to secure CalAmp data from that perspective. But like, what is CalAmp, right? So CalAmp is mainly around telematics and software analytics. So we provide a lot of services in terms of transportation and logistics. And we're constantly expanding kind of that footprint, right? So we had our recent acquisitions of Synovia, Here's Come the Bus, which does a lot of that tracking for parents. And then we have LoJack, which is what a lot of people know us better by. So we have the stolen vehicle recovery systems involved with that. So it's super cool industry to be in. I wouldn't call it niche anymore because, what we call it is IoT, right? For us at home. So it's really IoT security at this point. And it's tying in everything globally, making sure it's connected. But part of the reason why I lost all my hair a long time ago was now how do I secure all of that, right? I think it's a challenging opportunity, but it's a fun one. So yeah, it really ties into that passion. But
so that sounds like a really broad portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
What, and particularly like, I've been focused on cloud and data center security and development and stuff, but I've never dealt with edge devices and IoT. What's a day like for you? I mean, what do you spend your time doing?
So a lot of the experience I got from military, so kind of going back a little bit. So I was born and raised in Indiana on a farm, and I never thought I would be, sitting here in Southern California having this type of conversation, right? So this is I always think back on that, which is always fascinating. But yeah,
I grew up in Iowa and Wisconsin mostly, so I can really relate to that. And that's one of the things. Just to interject briefly, for everyone who's listening, I think one of the beautiful things about our industry is if you get skilled, you can come from anywhere and really make a ton of success in this business.
Oh yeah. And kind of expanding on that. So where I was at, there's not a lot of people. So how would I get into anything that dealt with computers? I'm going to be brutally honest and probably not going to be great on my resume, but I was a gamer, right? So I had a lot of free time. I was gaming. Oh no, who knew, right? but it got time to decide about, college. So I'm like, okay, well, what do I want to do? I was like, well, I could be a doctor. I was like, nah, not really. Do I want to be this? I want to be that. No, I couldn't. I couldn't see myself doing those things. But back then we just called it computers. So yeah, so I picked a career in IT as it was called then, and kind of branched off from there. But outside of that, because September 11th also happened right after I got out of school. So most of the jobs went to the defense sector, and I took up the call at that time as well, and decided to join the armed services.
Well, thank you for your service.
I appreciate that. So yeah, so I was stationed down in Florida, and I did a lot of work in terms of tactical communications. That's also another broad term. But essentially is you're taking your data center type technology and you're putting it in kind of like ruggedized containers, and you're taking it out and on missions, supporting our servicemen and women. Then from that point, is actually family is what drove me to my next move, and that was in Germany, where I met my wife, my beautiful Thai wife, in an Irish bar in the middle of Germany, hearing the American, right?
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was great. There's more to that story, but not for this conversation. So yeah, so I decided to make the transition into semi-private industry, but it was more of a defense contractor. Mm-hmm. And that the transition from the military side into the contract side is really how I jumped into more of the cybersecurity specific role. There was more audit compliance. I wouldn't call it cybersecurity, but I consider them all different. But yeah, I had the knowledge that I have learned from the tactical communications, from the work that I did prior to, and now I leverage that in the cybersecurity world. So I have a lot of that experience building up into that, because you really have to know kind of multiple aspects and how all that ties together, and then that's how you can secure it, right?
Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna stop us for a second.
Sure.
Because I want to introduce the audience to, well, anyone who's a repeat knows that we do this, but we at Fugue used to do a lot of events and give out a whole lot of swag, and obviously that's not happening these days because we're all stuck in our home offices and dealing with a pandemic. So what we're doing today is I'm going to put up some backgrounds, and Greg mentioned being a gamer. I'm a big time gamer, always have been. We're going to do backgrounds from video games, the history of computing, and science fiction and anime. And the way this is going to work is if you can be the first person in chat to tell us if it's a computer, the model of computer it is. If it's a really tough one, because I've got some weird ones in here, even maybe like the manufacturer would be good enough, but we're really looking for the model. Okay, so if I put up a picture of a computer, the game it's from, or the science fiction TV show or movie it's from. All right, and let's go ahead, since we were talking about gaming, I'm gonna start with a game. Let's see here. Which one should we do?
And also put your answers in the chat, clicking on all panelists and attendees so everybody can see your answer.
Oh, I'm pretty light on game backgrounds, but let's do this one. I think Greg knows. But Greg, you can't guess. It's got to be from the audience.
No.
Okay, Sivia Drew, I'll tell you what this is so you can keep an eye on it in the chat for me while I keep talking to Greg. Okay, so Greg, you touched on an interesting point there, as well, a bunch, but one that left out of me a little bit, which is you said that you've worked in compliance and also security, and while those are somewhat different, you view them as related. Can you describe that relationship between compliance and security from your perspective?
Well, if I take a look at the broader term of information security's role is protecting the data of whatever entity that you work for, right? And then we take a step back and we say, well, what is information technology? Because everyone generally lumps IT and InfoSec together, right? Information technology is more the operational arm of that, right? So if information security is protecting the data, the role is to ensure the compliance thereof, right? So you have the control implementation, then you have the compliance measuring are the controls that you put in place adequate and appropriate for whatever you're trying to do, right? And then there's this whole other piece, audit. It's a whole other beast. So, and then that's when somebody's usually coming in. Oh, there we go. Oh, I got somebody in there. You have somebody looking from the outside, testing those, what we call controls. If you're GDPR, you're talking about mechanisms. So there's all kinds of different terminology, and that's where compliance comes in as kind of that intermediary that translates all that for us. And liability, I hear my son coming, so we will be interrupted. I'm 100% sure. So
no worries. I actually think that's one of the nice things about one of the silver linings of everyone being at home is it's kind of humanizing, you know, when your pet walks in or your child comes by, and I actually find that nice. So we do have a winner. Who said the sub game. This is the Chocobo racing game from Final Fantasy VII is the parent game. So we do have a winner. You're going to get a cool T-shirt and some other neat stuff. So in that description where you're talking about the controls, and of course there's the audit side, but I'm thinking more about like the practical preventing bad guys from stealing data aspect of why those controls are there. And the audit side is more to prove what you've been doing. But in my mind, there should be a feedback loop between what's happening in the real world and what those controls are. So that, you know, as in cloud, we're seeing breaches that are just new. And maybe the old control families and compliance aren't necessarily capturing that. Have you seen that? And how do you view that potential feedback loop of changing?
Yeah, for me, it's tough, right? Because like in the military, you had a predefined set of things that you had to work through. You had your playbooks, you had your emergency action plans, you had all that type of stuff. Everything's predefined for you, and you walk through all those procedures. But in reality, it's not like that. We all know that. So trying to, like for me, I had to try to pick a framework that's easy to rely upon. It's something, because I also have a board reporting responsibility. And that is, okay, well, what can I share to the board? And I just picked the NIST cybersecurity framework because I can walk it all the way down to something very specific. If I want to, I can modify it to apply what I'm getting from threat intelligence, and applying that into that risk model. And I call it a risk model. And then get it up to the 5 functional areas. So identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So I say, hey, can I identify it? And then what are my areas to identify? And now that I've identified it, can I protect it? And now that I've had those protection controls in place, can I detect it? If I detect something, how do I respond? And then obviously once you respond, you have to recover. I hope you can. Yep. and then you have postmortems, lessons learned. It depends on how positive you are that day. So
yeah, I think the recover aspect is something folks think too little about, actually, at least in my experience. Mm-hmm. A lot of times, one of the positives of the compliance frameworks and security policies are that you can organize your thoughts and you can understand your posture against those controls. Mm-hmm. But just when we were teaching the S3 high secure S3 bucket, one of the points that I tried to make is like having versioning turned on is a big deal from a security perspective, because if somebody goes and uses, gets access and encrypts your data using keys they don't share with you, it's really nice to just roll back,
Exactly.
Cool. Let's talk a little bit about how cloud security is different than data center security, and what's been your experience there, because you've been at this for a while. And what I love about your background is everything from like tactical communications, where I did some work in national security where we were helping support, Katrina recovery and things like that.
Yep.
So I know what you're talking about there. That's pretty close to the wire kind of work in some ways, getting radio communications working and so on, all the way through to data center and cloud. Tell us about the differences between really particularly the data center world and the cloud world from your perspective.
So when I think data center, I think of something that's more physical, right? And then you have a rack and stack of servers and behind a closed cage. And now data centers are essentially all colos, right? Unless you build your own. So really when you're moving to more of the cloud security model, you're going to pizza as a service, right? So you're going, you own everything to owning bits and pieces as you go further up the stack to all the way up to PaaS, right? So data center security to me is, okay, now I've got to protect everything within that center itself, whether it be the cage, the personnel. I have to apply physical security controls. I have to have, if I'm thinking CISSP, how many, candle, lumen, whatever light, lights, and how many meters something has to be in front of it, away from a door. But then when I think about cloud security, I don't have to worry about those things. Now, because essentially what I'm doing is I'm, transferring that risk from the physical security side to the cloud provider. And then we have to make sure the contracts are all good to alleviate and cover those risks. But now you're more in IaaS and, PaaS and all those types of things, where now I'm just focused on the data. And depending on your business model, you still may have to patch an OS, right? An operating system. But you're really more focused on the data. And to me personally, you have more visibility. Because within a data center, you've got to apply what's called defense in depth measures extensively, meaning multiple appliances doing different things. And usually you have a large team that's creating proprietary ways to understand and correlate all this stuff. While in the data security, or not data security, cloud security model, you can leverage, tools and platforms that are already native to the platform, or you can leverage other things that are tied into the API or other methods that you can just get that visibility right out of the gate, which to me is fantastic. It's something I've never been able to have before.
Well, it makes me happy to hear that, because, well, before I go on to the next thought, I'm going to do another background here. We're 15 minutes in, so let's find something else. Maybe we'll do something from the history of computing. Let's do this guy. So here we're looking for the name of the machine. This is a real computer.
It is.
This one's kind of tough. It was, I'll give you some hints. We need the name of the company or the name of the computer itself. They didn't last for long. It's not a household name in computing. They're no longer around. It was 80s company. They made the coolest looking computers maybe ever still, I think. But those lights on the front, each one of those represents a processor, because these were massively parallel computers. So one of the only place I've seen one in the flesh is at the National Cryptologic Museum. I'm a big time computer history nerd. So if I'm out in San Jose, I go to the Computer History Museum there. If I'm here on the East Coast, every now and again, I'll go by the National Cryptologic Museum, which is the little museum just outside of no such agency, just outside of the NSA, who, by the way, had a lot to do with inventing supercomputing. We got somebody saying it's a cray. It is not a cray. It is not a cray. Sorry, Reed. Yep. It's pretty obscure. So we'll see if we don't get any takers. I'll throw another one up. But where I was going with that is, you mentioned something. So you and I come from very different backgrounds in a way, in that you have been a security practitioner, I believe, through most of your career. I've been a developer through most of my career, focused on security. And in the past, we would be like at other ends of the building from each other. You know what I mean? And a very different view of the world. But you said that you had visibility you never had before. And what occurred to me when founding Fugue, the reason I founded Fugue with Drew, was through APIs, these two domains could fully intersect, where you can now query the infrastructure for its state. You can't do that. You're doing a data call in a data center and getting back an Excel spreadsheet. So I think, to me, I was excited to hear your optimism about that, because I think a lot of times cloud gets this reputation for being insecure or hard to secure, when actually we now, because of APIs, have the potential for it to be the most secure and consistent, computing infrastructure we've ever had.
Right.
So where is CalAmp on your journey to cloud, if you can talk about it?
Well, we've had a kind of interesting past too, right? So we've been more on the hardware kind of producer, OEM type of mentality. But with like CTC, for example, CalAmp Telematics Cloud, we do a lot of that analytical stuff from our cloud providers, right? I'm not going to go into anything specific there, but
Sure.
but that's really the transformation, right? Is, okay, well, you have these devices that are plugged into cars or trucks or what have you, or into equipment, and now we can, modify or manipulate the data to your choosing, right? So, and then what do you get out of it, right? For the end consumer, and then really your opportunities are endless at that point. Now, what else can I do with it? What else, from a sales side, what else can I sell? Right. So I have this data, right? But then I put my hat back on, so a cybersecurity hat back on, and I'm like, well, okay, how do I protect it? Right. So I have to protect it from end to end, and I have to, assure whoever the customer is that their data is protected and secure, and whether it be on the device or all the way to the back end and wherever it sits. And heck, we haven't even talked about supply chain security. So how do we go all the way back to wherever it's being produced and protect it there too? So your IP. So it's multifaceted. There's a ton that goes into it, which is why when you say global head, I'm like, oh, geez, maybe I'm gonna, ask for a bigger team or something.
Yeah,
but it's not
I
always
hear
the
you.
case, right? It's leveraging the tools and technologies you have to make it more efficient and automated and repeatable at the end of the day.
Yeah, well, automated and repeatable to me is, in programming, we call that determinism, right? Like making things deterministic so that you know what's going to happen before it happens. And if you do it twice, you get the same result. I think that was impossible when we were racking and stacking boxes, or nearly impossible. I mean, there were some organizations that could do it, but it's so expensive to get out.
And you have to code to the lowest hanging fruit. If I remember, I was building a few of it. I'm not perfect by any means, but I always had to code to the lowest hanging fruit, and it generally tied back to hardware, which is super frustrating.
Well, it's interesting that, well, before we go, nobody got this. I'm going to tell you what it is because I went too obscure. This was a company called Thinking Machines, and this was called the Connection Machine 2. And they really knew how to have like some swagger with their computer designs back then. All right, let's go to some science fiction. See if you guys like that more. All right, this is a famous anime from the 90s. All right, to continue on that though, well, you have to deal with something that a lot of folks don't, which is IoT. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that it is its own domain from a security practice perspective. I've done, very small scale around my house stuff, but not, right. What you guys do is global. Mm-hmm. How is that? What are the challenges there? How is it different than other things? Oh, well, we got a winner. All right, Scott Elbert. Yes, it's Cowboy Bebop. Yay!
Awesome. Congrats,
yeah, it's a great anime. If you've never seen it, it's just a classic, and it's got a great soundtrack, a lot of style. But yeah, sorry, I asked you a question and then I interrupted your answer. But please go ahead. IoT.
Okay. Yeah. So in reality, I think it really is its own domain, but with caveats, right? It's its own domain, but it's still a computing device at the at the basic level, right? So what are the same practices that I leverage from a traditional IT perspective, IT security perspective? I call it enterprise security. And how do I leverage what we've learned from that space and bring that down to the device level? And what are some of the challenges? Well, this device is out of my control. It could be either managed or unmanaged. Much smaller form factor. I hear you coming again. Much smaller form factor. And how do I apply, heavily coded environments or security controls to that? Or can you? And then what risk are you willing to accept because of that form factor? So you're talking about 8-bit, 16-bit, 32, 64, and then what levels of security you can apply onto that. Then you have the tampering, perspective, and you have warranty labels, which don't really mean much to the bad guy. So you have different things to consider, which are some of the things that we have to worry about from an insider perspective and an enterprise security model, meaning your laptop and things from that perspective. So some things kind of carry over, but then some things are different because you may or may not have to worry about, channeling, right? So going outside of frequency, then what is the intended use of the device, right? So there's different things you have to worry about from an enterprise security model that's different on the IoT side. It's fun. That's a lot of fun.
I can believe it. I mean, I've heard stories of like botnets made out of smart appliances and things like that. And
Raspberry Pis.
huh?
Good times.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
a Raspberry Pi plugged in the back of a TV, or somebody drops it into a conference room.
Right. Yeah, that's just not a domain, as I said, that I've been too familiar with. But it sounds like, as I'm thinking about it, perhaps the exposure from a single device is probably not as great as the exposure of the compute resources they're communicating with. Is that fair or not?
It depends, right? It depends on what data is going over that, right? And who your customer is. So I'm just going to toss
Sure.
out, let's say, a government customer, right? So they say you must protect, they use the word must a lot. So you must do all these different types of thing, and there's potentially secret data behind it, for example, right? So in that case, one device can cause significant damage, right? National security damage at a secret level, right? So it really is a depend use case, but I think for me, it goes back to your point. So if it's traditional commercial security, maybe not so much, maybe not one device, but now I've got to worry about, millions of devices, 10,
Yeah.
15, 20, 30, 40 million. And if I have a bug in one, I have a bug in all.
Right. So
So
that's got to be fun, making sure everything gets patched and keeping track of that and so on. That does not sound trivial. Well, let's change gears a little bit to, so you've made this transition from dealing with pre-cloud and cloud compute infrastructure. There are probably some folks in the audience who are facing that now, especially with what's been going on with COVID and so on. We know a lot of workloads are moving to cloud, but they were before anyway. Do you have any advice for folks that are making that transition about the things that they need to think about?
Well, it really provides an opportunity to take a look at the things that you're migrating, right? Obviously, you've already made the choice to going to a cloud provider. So hopefully everyone's done their due diligence and you know what things from your policy that you need to apply to that cloud provider. But what I mean by it provides an opportunity to revisit and look at the things that you haven't looked at, let's say in a large organization, maybe 20 years. Let's say you've got a mainframe. Oof, gotta love those. Or you've got this old system that hasn't been touched in 15, 20 years because it's so-called private, right?
Yes.
But now that you're moving to a cloud provider, you have an opportunity to relook at it and say, well, one, do I rehost it to that virtual data center? Can I refactor it? So I change it a little bit to modify it to fit in that environment. Can I just revise it all together? But when I mean revise,
so that sounds like you're saying there's kind of
5 R's of cloud migration. It really comes down to the 5 R's of cloud migration, right? So you rehost, refactor, revise, rebuild, or replace. Obviously, number 5 is probably I wouldn't call it the easiest approach because you really have to understand your data flow and how that whatever particular thing works. But it does provide you the most opportunity in terms of operationalizing more of the efficiency of that whatever thing is. Right, and then rehost is simply like your lift and shift, which can be extremely costly. So you have areas to kind of consider it as you have a chance to relook at that opportunity.
So it sounds though, and you used the word opportunity a couple times, and that's what I was hearing when you were talking about it. Like if you haven't looked at something in 20 years, that's actually like unknown risk, that's sitting out there. And and I like that I don't know, I'm an eternal optimist. So that opportunity of taking things to cloud is an opportunity to really assess where you are and what decisions you should make, it sounds like.
Yeah, and in some cases, it depends on the organization, right? You've got to leverage, audits that say you must do these certain types of things that say, well, you have to take a look. And what if that person no longer exists within the organization, right? So now you have a chance to replace within a cloud provider and provide you everything you needed to check off the audit box, right? So That's where the opportunity comes in. You're making security the differentiator that helps you optimize whatever that thing is. And then what a lot of people may or may not realize, you can start to sell it, right? Whatever that thing is, whatever that service is, if you can sell it, which is a huge win. So now you're decoupling away from whatever the dependencies were on a traditional data center model, changing it to a cloud security or cloud model. And now you have different opportunities in front of you.
Interesting.
So your business model might change, but I would still, now I'm going to go to business strategy. I would focus on your core competencies first, right? So what are those things? And then you kind of branch out to the peripherals.
So one other interesting part of your background that I'm hearing through here is you're one of the few people in security that I'm aware of that also went and got an MBA. And I think that's an interesting decision, because as I'm hearing you talk, you're thinking about the practice of security, but the business that it's supporting. And, I've been at a lot of events where, maybe some security folks who don't think from a business perspective have very kind of monolithic thought about security, and the business side doesn't get us and things like that.
Yeah.
But you've embraced both. How do you reconcile those? How do you view that relationship? Because they're both within your own head. So.
Well, think about it from this perspective. So when somebody in information security is trying to get a project done, and they don't get the answer they hear, they just get frustrated, right? And then they say, well, I'm going to run this test, or I want to find this vulnerability, yada, yada, yada. That might be a good kind of first step and kind of foot in the door mentality, but it doesn't help you see the big picture and what the business is trying to do, right? So the business says, well, I gotta make revenue on this, and then how can you support? I'm like, okay, that changes my thought outlook a little bit, because my passion is to protect the company, right? But protecting the company meaning lose the revenue.
Right.
I may not have a job at the end of the day, right? So
then what are you protecting, right?
Yeah. So I'm protecting the revenue also, right? So now I've got to protect the revenue. I got to put the guardrails in place to support that type of mentality. And then how do we do that? None of that is technical by any means.
Well, I agree, but maybe some of the techniques to get there are somewhat technical, in that one of the things I've been seeing with cloud is, so in the old days, at least in my experience, when I was working in national security, or when I was at AWS, you would build something, and you would try to keep in mind the phone book of like NIST 853 regs, and you were like, yeah, we should encrypt stuff, and
Vision 4.
yeah, we need a password policy. You knew a certain amount of it, but you would get to the end, and then you would go through what CNA or whatever process you're using, depending on the security practice where you are, and inevitably there would be rework. And so security became this gating function, and it was frustrating, and we would take hours and days to interview to explain the system, and then we might have to go buy a different database or something, in a bad case. Whereas now with cloud, because of the APIs that we were talking about earlier, you can be constantly, in an automated and repeatable way, checking. Correct. And so I'm seeing this as like the big opportunity for security to become people that help grow revenue rather than slow down progress. And I wonder what you think of that idea.
Yeah, so my comment earlier about becoming the differentiator, I think that's key, right? So we're talking about building revenue, protecting revenue, putting the guardrails in there. Now you can say, well, this is what we did at CalAmp, to put in these specific security measures. We can do this to help others. So because we've made that digital transformation, right? Now you can say, well, how can we help and approach others? And CalAmp is a differentiator in that case, right? We provide security all the way down to the end. So it's a different spin on it, right? But at the end of the day, we still got to protect the revenue. We got to go through the audit process. We got to do compliance. But you hit on a very key point, as making it repeatable. Moving it to whatever the pipeline that you're calling it, left or right. You're moving to all the way down to where the coders are, writing the code, and we're making sure, we're putting the right stuff in QA. We're, automating all those different types of processes, whatever tool or platform you have or person. in there, making sure the security is done from the beginning, so you don't have to go to the end and spend the 7-8K per person to rebuild the whole damn thing.
Well, and that's where I think we're meeting, right? From the software side, software engineering side, and the security side, is because we have APIs. What's software good at? Automation and repetition. Humans are terrible at both of those things, right? Humans get bored, they make mistakes. I mean, computers are pedantic.
So yeah.
I'm sorry?
And I have a short attention span, so yeah. So I see a shiny edge, I'm like, ooh.
Yep. and computers don't care, right? They're going to do exactly what you tell them to. So if you can design the system such using software engineering practices and programming practices, and that's feasible now in cloud because of APIs, you can be very sure that every good and bad decision you've made as a human is going to be repeated exactly as you made it, whether it was good or bad, as many times as
good or bad gets repeated over and over. Yeah.
Exactly. Cool. I'm going to do another background here. Let's switch gears again. We'll do, that one might be too esoteric. Let's see. Let's do this. All right. This is better now. The last computer I gave you, I just think is the coolest looking computer ever, so I always put it in there. But this one, is more famous. You just tell the manufacturer and you can win some swag. You used a term that often I associate with like marketing speak, but you used it really well and to real effect, which was digital transformation. Oh, we got a bunch of answers on this one. You can't win twice. Let's see. Neil M. Has Neil M. won before in this session? Sylvia, help me here.
Sorry, coming off mute would help.
Oh, yeah.
No, he has not won today.
All right, Neil M. I think gets it there.
Yep.
Okay, right on, Neil. Yes, this is the famous Cray 1 supercomputer. If you've ever seen the inside of one of these things, it was back in the era where they would hand solder wires, and it is you would not want to like spill a beer in there. It would cost a lot of money.
Rubber mats and then the ESD wristbands tied to something. Yeah.
But a nice padded bench for you to sit on outside of it, at least in the marketing photos. But back to the question. So digital transformation, I mean, a lot of people throw that around and I'm just, whatever. But the way you used it, I found fascinating. Can you go into what you meant by that and how security has a role in that?
Yeah, so it's a buzzword, right? So this digital transformation was trying to figure out a way to apply a strategy to what we're doing in terms of cloud migration around the 5 Rs, right? So how security kind of fits into that. I think security was more of the drive. Well, for me personally, it was more of a driving force and saying, hey, look, I can't see anything that's in there in the data center. I want to see what's going on in the cloud. So for me, I've always leveraged security as kind of the driver to make that digital transformation happen.
Yeah.
And it got the technical teams and InfoSec teams aligned quickly. At least in my experience, it's not always the same case for everyone, because you still have to justify the business and all that other stuff that you still have to do. But essentially, what you're doing is you're taking everything that you've done here, you're reducing some of the risk at this level, you're transferring that risk to somebody else, and you're only focused on this little piece, and then you're moving that up in some way, shape, or fashion, right? And then you're focused on the things that you've been trying to do, and that's your core competency. So I've had to build all this stuff out to support the core of my business. Now I don't have to anymore, so I'm just going to focus on the core of my business and what I can leverage and make opportunistic at that point.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued by the way you've been describing this and thinking about it, because it sounds like you're looking for business opportunities that are derived from getting security right. And I think that's a really important mindset for people to have. I founded Fugue and I was the CEO for a while, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to go hire a CEO. because I'm a geek. I don't think that way. Like, I'm thinking about systems architectures and stuff like that. So we went and hired this amazing CEO. But what I'm hearing from you is that you're thinking about both sides of that equation, and that there's an opportunity there for security practitioners to gain success in the field by thinking that way, as opposed to kind of an oppositional, create a defensive, be defensive with the business side, because that's usually how I hear it from security practitioners.
Yeah, and you'll hear it like, well, I feel like I'm an outsider, right? Like you'll have that feeling. I've had that feeling, right? Like, I'm the outsider in the group because, I'm passionate about this, but nobody understands. So I'm not saying that the MBA kind of, bridged that gap, but it was really kind of a transition of thought I had. It's like, well, how can I implement the strategies to protect data in the organization if I don't know how to speak the language that everyone else is speaking? Right? How do I speak with a CFO, for example? Well, I'm gonna have to learn what a balance sheet is and do all those different types of things. And hopefully, you never have to close a book. Whew, that's challenging. It takes a lot of time. And remember, I said I have a short attention span. Yeah, figure that one out. And then
I would never want to be a CFO. One of my best friends in the world is the CFO at Fugue. I've known him for 20 years, and I watch him at the end of the quarter, and I think that's respect, man. Like, that's not the job.
It's tough, and I get it, right? So, like, they've got to figure out. I was like, well, Greg, like, why are you spending so much money? I was like, well, we have this, glaring risk. It's critical, blah blah blah. And they're like, okay, but what does that mean in terms of numbers? So the conversation always comes back to something that's not security. So how do I understand kind of that speak? And then you got legal, you've got marketing. I'm using marketing terms, right? Sales, and then the entirety of the whole picture, which is the executive that has to manage it all, right? So how do I speak the same language, get in the same room, and say, hey, look, this thing over here, it's wide open. We need to protect that. And then now you have a seat at the table to say, okay, well, Greg is saying that there's this glaring hole over here. We haven't focused on it, and this is going to impact the brand. Boom. Right? So it's correlating the dots for everyone in that room, and which is one of the reasons why I chose NIST cybersecurity framework, because I could break it down into 5 different areas. I could come up with some score or whatever and make it easy to read and say, look, we're a 2. They're like, a 2 of what? 2 of 6. 2 is good. Like, oh, okay, great. And then if they ask more questions, you can dig down, right? Or if they want, I can go all the way in how to do a command injection attack through a website through username, whatever, right? How many characters are allowing on a website? And I could go on there, whatever website they want, and walk them through it if they want to go that low. But nobody's at a board levels that ever asked me that question.
So I'm tempted to go in 2 different directions here of the conversation, because you're one of the you deal with a board, you deal with a C-suite, right? And that's its whole own area. But I want to ask you a narrower question, because you were just describing like doing an injection attack. That brings to my mind pen testing and like the really nitty gritty finding. I mean, compliance frameworks are great, and I think NIST is the definitive one in my view of the world. Most of the others are derivative, I believe. And Fugue does this for a living, and we've done NIST, and we've done dozen or more of them, and most of them are subsets of NIST in one way or another, with a few extra things hanging off the side. But when we're talking about actually testing the system, so let's say we've accredited the system, we've said it meets the controls, whether we're SOC or NIST or whatever, but that doesn't necessarily mean bad guys can't get in. So you need to actually test that. How has that changed in the era of cloud? How are you thinking about that these days?
Well, in some regards, you could say we're more exposed, because it goes back to something you mentioned earlier, misconfiguration. You talked about S3 specifically, you talked about versioning, we talked about, okay, you probably talked about in an S3 class, okay, well, is encryption, is that checkbox enabled? Because it's pretty darn easy, it's a checkbox. And then, or what about my bucket policies? So you start going through those different types of things, right? And clearing out the, wild card, super frustrating. And then saying it's, worldwide, publishable. Oh, it just drives me nuts, right? So Crap, I sort of go on a tangent there, didn't I? What was the
I was
question?
asking about approaches to penetration testing.
Okay, penetration. Okay, yeah. So in some regards, most folks think they're more exposed, but as long as you have the right security measures, you're there. But it also gives us an avenue to leverage different types of penetration testing against that type of model, right? You may be more exposed from, okay, I've got IPs that are out there or URLs that are out there, depending on the approach you're taking. But me personally, I don't like using the word pen test because that's an annual thing that requires a significant amount of resources to get spun up, and you hire this third party to come in and they do a limited scope test against your environment. I like, more of the security researcher model where you bring in folks that actually think like, the other folks, coming in and doing live testing with a limited set of data you give them. And what I like to try to do is kind of get that model tied into sort of your CI/CD pipeline, so that you can do what's called, what I love the term, is attack simulation. So you tie it in at all facets of the business, all facets of development, and it just, I love it. And I love it when they find something too. It's great.
I'm with you on that. We've gone at Fugue to a model where we're using HackerOne.
Okay.
And we put out bounties, right? I mean, there's a certain amount you pay for the service, but then you say, here's how much we're willing to pay for these things. Go at it. And we really started doing that when early in Fugue, we started doing, we would read about, of course, what Fugue does is protect cloud infrastructure. So we have to know how the bad guys are attacking the cloud infrastructure. Right. So one of the most fun parts of my job is to simulate, to try to recreate those attacks. And it quickly dawned on us that the attackers in cloud are doing completely different attack surfaces and vectors than ever before. Mm-hmm. And when we were engaging with like the contract pen testers, they were still thinking about, operating system patching. Okay, you still have to do operating system patching, but are you aware of like lateral movement in IAM? And they weren't. But at HackerOne, you've got a lot of white hat, black hats, a lot of security researchers who are really going to go at it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a great point, because now you're, okay, so threat is always ever evolving, right? So whatever happens in the world, it's always changing. So if you're leveraging, let's say, security researchers, for example, right? So they're going to be more in the know, or they just simply don't care about whatever risk framework or cybersecurity framework you're going to use. So yeah, I've done all these wonderful things. I got this audit. I checked this box off. Great. Now I want to hire this guy who doesn't care about any of that.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're gonna eat us alive. And I love that aspect of it. My colleagues in the executive space don't, but I'm like, well, if we don't know, then how are we going to fix it when the bad thing happens, right? So then we start.
It's funny sometimes. I was teaching something on some cloud services, and somebody said, "Can you just share a secure configuration with us?" And why don't the cloud providers do that? It reminded me of. Well, for what? A secure configuration to do what? Is the question. And when you have a lot of configurability and a lot of use cases that can be served, what that means is there's a lot of risks you have to learn about and new ways that, and bad guys are really clever and they will find the cracks. And I think there's a sort of pyrrhic desire among non-practitioners in this space, like, can't you just make it secure? And yeah, you can turn it off, right? But otherwise, you have to be
default deny on a firewall. Yeah, I remember those days where firewalls there. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we're coming up on. We've only got a few minutes left. I'm going to do one more background. Let's do this one. And then we'll wrap up a little bit and see if there's any Q&A. So here, you just need to tell us the TV show this is from. So while we're, okay, Sandra immediately nailed it.
Yeah.
This is the TARDIS. It's the TARDIS from the first Doctor Who, which I can't really recommend watching, but, but I liked it when I was a kid. I tried going back to it and I thought, you know, it was definitely low budget, but history making. And interestingly, the famous theme song to Doctor Who was done by this woman who absolutely pioneered electronic music in the BBC labs. And that whole thing is done. This is before you had like synthesizers with keyboards. She was making things like sine waves out of sine wave generators, recording them on tape, and then slowing and speeding the tape to get different notes. I mean, she was a truly, truly innovative person. And every time I hear that first version of the theme, it makes me think of that innovation. All right, we've got 5 or 6 minutes left. Let's see. Yeah, like I said at the beginning, a lot of folks ask after these things about like career tips in security, how to get into it. And maybe you can first talk about like how to get into it to start, and any advice you have there. And then as you get up to dealing with boards.
Yeah. Oh man, that's a big question.
Well, let's start with the first part, because that's the part I usually get asked about.
Well, I always, the advice I try to give is say, look, like, what are you trying to do? Like, what path do you want? Like, if you just want to do like UIs and you want to do that stuff, you can go down the compliance aspect of it, right? Where you're working with tools and working within those tools. Or if you want to get into more of the penetration testing, like what is your favorite programming language, right? These are also very similar to like my interview questions. So I'm like, okay, well, what are the things you've done in the past? Well, I've leveraged these 6 or 7 tools, and I've worked through the UI, and I've gone through all these different types of things. I'm like, great. So I have an idea where you're going to go. Or if I'll toss out, well, what's your favorite programming language? And they say, well, it's this, 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 and this. I'm like, so you're probably going to go down this route, which could be penetration testing, right? You start doing your red team, blue team, purple, name your color. There's a bunch of them now. White hat, black. I mean, whatever, right? So because each one has a different set of capabilities that you're going to have to leverage to get to your end state, right? And now everything in cloud is much more code based, so my expectation is going to be more code based, right? So what I ask this question in every single interview now is like, what is your favorite programming language, right? But the advice I have to give is like, okay, well, you want to get into—
Greg, what's your favorite programming language?
Oh, there's a bunch now. I'm leaning on Python today, just to be brutally honest.
Yeah,
I do a lot of work with AWS, but it's not the only cloud provider I work with. So anyway.
I just had to ask you that since you said it was an interview question, and
I like Python. Anyway, I used to do Java in the past, C++. Anyway, yeah, some older ones in there. So the advice I give is like, okay, well, based on your background, like where do you want to go? What do you find exciting? I think that's really important. And then I can kind of build out kind of a game plan, like, okay, well, I want to do compliance, right? So here are the different types of things you want to do within that type of area. Or if you want to do, DevSecOps or whatever the buzzword is today, securing that, I can get you down OSCP, Office of Security, certification. We can go down that route, which is a lot of fun. So
I think you hit on something that I find absolutely critical in anything. When my son, who's now in his 20s, was talking to me when he was in his teens about things he wanted to do, and the advice I gave him is the same advice I give employees or friends or et cetera, which is find something you're really excited about, because if you're not, someone else is, and they're going to be better at it than you because of that. They're going to spend more time. And I think one of the themes we're trying to do in this Masterclass series is to help people find that, right? We can't, in an hour here, an hour there, give you an advanced degree, right? But what we're trying to do, and Greg, really, thank you so much for doing this with us, because I think you have that passion and that history and that knowledge, is to show people, both in the technical deep dives, but also in these kinds of conversations, the different aspects of developing mastery. And the only way you're going to develop mastery is by doing it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And the way you're going to do it yourself is by caring about it and enjoying it.
Right.
So let me ask you this. With that in mind, a lot of people think of what you do and what I do as very dry. And I don't think either of us think of it as dry. What's really cool about it in your experience and in what you do?
So for me, it feels like it's the Wild West, right? So who talks about IoT security? You have, the IoT Security Foundation, IoTSF. I mean, you have different groups out there that talk about it, but it always goes back to your comment. It's like, oh, it's so dry. Like, oh my God, you got to go through and you got to do all this stuff. I'm like, what's fun is going in and breaking it. But at the end of the day, it's like I get to go in and I get to find the holes and I get to do new things that people don't get to do on a daily basis. Yeah, I get to work through the tools and do all these other things, and I get to implement these different technologies, which is also really fun to me. But it reminds me, like, well, why do I find it really fun? Is I remember when I was a kid, I was taking apart this new technology called a VCR, and I was like, man, like, how does this work? So I got to learn about ohm resistance, resistance, and then capacitance and storing of energy and short bursts, blah blah blah. And then, like, what happens if I sent this thing over here and it went over there? Like, does it blow up or does it,
I hope that wasn't by discharging a cap on yourself.
Anyway, I look back and I'm like, man, I'm surprised I'm still here. But
yeah, well, there's, career-wise, I'm surprised I'm still here too, because, and I agree with you. I work on tube amplifiers and stuff, and I love working literally at the wire level. But I also think a lot of folks, in my experience, if you're passionate, what goes along with that often is, and you were talking about this a minute ago, like telling those folks at the C level why we need to do this. Mm-hmm. And that kind of conviction comes with the passion. And with conviction comes, to some degree, risk-taking, because you're sticking your neck out and you're saying what you really think. I don't know. Does that resonate with you? Has that been your experience?
Oh, yeah. And I also know the flip side of it too, right? Is like some of those conversations could be job ending. So, I remember I was telling somebody, I was like, yeah, I walk into this conversation, I already had my resume updated. They're like, huh? I was like, I knew what I was going to say was going to be challenging at best. To the person who's going to listen to it. So I'm using more of executive speak because, it's the audience I was talking to at the time. But I remember going into that room, I was like, man, I hope they receive this well. I hope I get the point across well enough because I could be really technical, right? And they got it. I still have a job. I have a really good looking resume too, but anyway.
That's been my experience too, is like, if you're trying to develop, I had this incredibly uncomfortable experience where I inherited a system that wasn't quite done yet. And what I discovered was it should not have been done that way at all. And I had to stand in a room full of like flags and tell them this. And everyone else retreated to the back and like, okay, Josh, you go.
Explain it
when
to
you
me.
do these things,
explain it how it should be done. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Explain it to me how it should be done. Right.
Well, I guess one of the things I'm trying to say is like, because again, we get a lot of career questions. If you're going to tell the truth and you're working in security, you are not going to always be telling people things they want to hear. Often you're going to be telling people things they do not want to hear. Mm-hmm. And it does require quite a bit of intestinal fortitude to do that. And it does require you being confident and passionate about what you're doing to actually do the job. And I think those things all go together with fun. Like what you were talking about, taking apart the VCR, my favorite thing to do is figure out how to break a config. And then my next favorite thing to do is write rules that would catch somebody doing what I figured out how to do to break the config, and then bake those into Fugue. But it's a neat field. We're over time. I gotta say, I gotta respect people's time. Greg, thank you so much. I'm gonna go back to sharing screen just so that I can share with folks. Where is it? That we're gonna be doing another technical deep dive masterclass in a couple of weeks on locking down AWS identity and access management. This is probably the service you need to be most worried about on AWS. It carries a ton of risk. A Also, so join us for that. Also, if you go to fugue.co, we have a forever free developer version of the product. You don't need to be a developer to use it. It just takes a few minutes to try it. And we will go analyze your cloud infrastructure for you and tell you where you have some, where you have deficiencies based on things like CIS benchmark and so on. So Drew, it looks like you've come back on. I'll turn it back over to you. Greg, this was a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, guys. Yeah, this is a great conversation, and we can go on all day for this. So
I think we could.
Yeah, thanks, Greg, again for coming on, and thanks everybody for joining us for this. This was a lot of fun. And again, we're going to be making a full series out of the masterclass sessions, the technical deep dives, and some really cool conversations with cloud security masters like Greg McCord at CalAmp. So thanks everybody again. Thank you, Greg. And we will see you soon.
thanks, and see everyone. Have a good weekend, by the way.
You too. Everybody.
Bye, everyone.